Welcome everyone to this afternoon's panel on Anonymity Labs company and funding. So I'll just introduce, see if it looks well. Yeah, these are the panel members we have. So starting with myself, I'm Aggelos Kiayias, chairing this panel. I'm chairing cybersecurity and privacy at the University of Edinburgh, also chief scientist of Input-Output HK. Moreover, I'm the coordinator of Panoramics, a Horizon 2020 European consortium aiming to provide a mixed-net infrastructure for Europe. So the moderator today is Claudia Diaz, associate professor at KU Leuven and lead of the privacy technologies team at COSIC. And the panel members is Roger Dingledine, president and co-founder of the Tor project, Steininger, CEO of List Authority, Halpin, a researcher at Inria and chief scientist of NIM, and finally Moritz Bartl of the Center for the Cultivation of Technology. So before we start the discussion, I'll just give a little bit of context how this came to be. So something that you could say like a 10 years challenge of how is your business model. So the business model used to be that you collect the data, all the data, and then some magic happens, you figure things out, and you profit. And the point here is that what we realized over time, that there are many reasons that this model is fundamentally flawed. So what it appears and what it seems to be the business model now and what we want is that some magic should happen before. Then you collect the data you need as a responsible data controller, and then you profit. And the problem here is that the magic that happens first, it's not only magic that should happen in your business model due to your business acumen, but should also be magic that should happen with the tools that you have to use in order to be able to deliver this type of principled data collection approach that businesses are supposed to carry out today. So, privacy by design default and technologies that support it is not the black sheep anymore. However, things are not simple. And here is the overarching question that I hope we'll be able to touch on this panel. So we know that there is a promised land somewhere with a plethora of very nice and desirable privacy-enhancing tools and systems. And the problem is we still do not know how to get there. And that's something that brings forth the challenges that our panel is going to undertake. First of all, privacy needs community. Without community, you have no privacy. And this is not something that cryptography or technology can actually solve. We need people. So the larger the anonymity side of the system, the better privacy it can offer. Moreover, privacy-enhancing tools are very complex objects, and they require highly sophisticated design and engineering. How do we provide that? Where are the resources for it? And what we have observed over decades, really, is that commercial initiatives still quite weak in comparison to the goal that we would like to reach. So with this short intro, I'll just return to our panel members and just say a little bit about the structure. So first, I'll pass it to Claudia, who is our panel moderator, and then we're going to go around the table where our panelists are going to make some short statements about their views on the topic. After that, we will open the floor for discussion and what I hope is going to be a lively back and forth of Q&As between all of us here on this topic about privacy. So, Claudia, on to you.
Thank you, Aggelos. So yeah, just to set the scene, I mean, we've had already a couple of decades of quite intensive research in privacy technologies, and we've seen a lot of really good ideas being published, being implemented in code sometimes, being deployed to some extent, but we have had very few successes actually in terms of technologies that really have a large user base and a sustainable uptake. So the questions that we would like our panelists to answer today is, okay, how do we successfully deploy these technologies in a sustainable manner? And that involves both having the funding to pay for the development and to pay for the cost of deployment, but also, as Aggelos has said, it requires a community, an engaged community of users, of operators to run the different components of the system, of developers to keep the software up to date and to keep improving it, researchers that look into the security of these systems and propose improvements to the design, and other actors that might be part of the ecosystem. So, yeah, we want our panelists to answer this, and the first to do so will be Roger from the Tor project. Actually, Roger is the author of the paper with the title Anonymity Loves Company that actually inspired the title of this panel, where he argues very convincingly that usability in anonymity technologies is actually a security property precisely because you have this aspect that you need to have a big community in order to be able to be anonymous in it. So, Roger.
Okay, hi everybody. Sounds like the microphone works. So I'm going to tell you a bit of background about Tor as an organization and Tor as a technology that will hopefully give us context for the rest of the panel. So Tor is a US nonprofit organization, Stiftung Foundation style group. We have a budget of something like $4 million a year, so we're either huge or tiny compared to what you might expect. One of the interesting things about Tor is the diversity of funding we've had over the years. We've been funded by the US government to do research and development and to go to interesting places and teach people how to be safer on the internet. We've also been funded by the Electronic Frontier Foundation so that there can be stronger privacy tools out there in the world for people to be safer. And we can get back to the funding one depending on what questions we want to ask. So another important thing about Tor, we are probably best known for the Tor browser, which is a version of Firefox that you can install, and it has Tor and everything built in, pre-configured to keep you safe so that you don't have to figure out how to change your browser and what privacy has to mean. So there are two pieces to what Tor is. The first piece is the IP address level privacy, or the network level privacy, where somebody watching your internet connection can't learn what websites you're going to, and somebody at the website end can't figure out where you're coming from. But the second piece is the application level privacy inside Tor browser, where cookies and Flash and fonts and all sorts of other things can give you away and make you recognizable over time. Another fun thing about Tor is the diversity of users that we have. There are two different measurements right now. It's kind of hard to count how many users we have because it's a privacy anonymity system. So one count has about 2 million users every day using Tor, and another count has about 8 million users every day using Tor. So the reality is probably somewhere in between. But the fun part of this is it's not all Syrian activists. It's a bunch of different people, ordinary bloggers, activists from around the world, companies and militaries. We've got cops using Tor. And that diversity is really important because if you're only one kind of user out there, then it's not possible to provide the level of privacy you want. I was doing a talk to the Dutch National Cyber Crime, whatever their group is called, and they were saying, oh yeah, we don't need Tor because we have our own anonymity system. And I asked a few more questions, and it turns out that there's this Dutch National Cyber Intelligence anonymity system only used by Dutch cops. And if you figure out that what their network address is, then, I mean, I don't know which Dutch cop it is, but that's not actually providing the level of security that they ought to want, and they hadn't really thought that through. So another piece to how Tor works is the distributed trust side of things. So a lot of people compare it to standard proxies or VPNs or something like that. And the key for Tor is we have a network of volunteer relays all around the world. There are 7,000 or 8,000 relays run by folks like you in the audience and other people who care about providing safety to the world. And the key for how Tor is safe is your Tor browser gets this list of these relays and builds a path through 3 of them. And the goal is that no single relay gets to be able to build a list of who the users are and what they're doing. So any single relay doesn't see enough to be able to learn what's going on. And that's critical because a lot of the centralized systems have an approach, privacy by policy. We promise not to screw you. We have all of your data, but we promise we won't screw you. And that's it's not a sustainable situation. We'd rather have something based on the technology. I was talking long ago to the CTO of Anonymizer.com, and he said, oh yeah, we never answer subpoenas. If we ever answered a subpoena, nobody would ever trust us ever again. And then I was doing a talk for the US Department of Justice like 6 months later, and one of them interrupted me and said, why can't you be like Anonymizer? It's easy. We send them a subpoena, they send us an answer. It's easy. Why can't you be like that? And I say this not to pick on a particular for-profit company. The problem is the model. They have the data, and they could screw you, and they promise not to. And you're never going to be able to learn whether they're actually following through. So this privacy by design or distributed trust approach is key to the technology, the design itself keeping you safe. Another key thing about Tor is the transparency side. Yes, it's open source. Yes, we document everything. Yes, we participate in the research community and write research papers. But we also show up in public and say, hi, I'm Roger, and answer any questions about Tor. And we try to do all of our design work in public so that anybody can participate and see why we made the decisions we made. And I talk to a lot of people who start off thinking, oh, haha, the privacy people are all about transparency, haha. And it's not a contradiction. Privacy is about choice, and we choose to be transparent in order to build as strong a community as we can. There are other privacy projects who've tried to be private about themselves while they're doing it, and the result is lack of trust in that community. So this notion of community and trust and transparency will keep coming up. How am I doing on time?
I think you filled already 5 minutes. Maybe you have some.
Okay, a couple more things to talk about, and then I'll pass it off to Moritz. So another piece that we could talk about in the Tor context is the censorship side of things. We've been thinking of this as a privacy tool in a lot of ways, but a lot of people in interesting parts of the world use it to get around surveillance and censorship, which are more connected than you might think. And a lot of people in Europe say, oh, I'm glad I don't live in over-theristan because they have censorship, but we don't have censorship. Belgium censors, Denmark censors, Sweden censors, England censors. This is a problem all over. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and come back to whatever I missed afterwards.
We'll have plenty of time for discussion. So, Moritz, maybe you can give us your perspectives from the CCT.
Okay, welcome. My name is Moritz Bartl. I want to give you a bit of a background of where I'm coming from before I go into what I'm doing now and what I'm involved in. So what you can see in the top left corner is the Department for Computer Science of the Technical University of Dresden, where I studied computer science, focused on anonymity and privacy, with Andreas Fitzmann as the professor, kind of leading person in anonymity research since the early 80s, pushing for technology implementation of privacy. This building that you can see, very fancy new computer science building, is now that he's passed away, sadly, named after him. So that's the Fitzmann building in Dresden. And this is where I studied. And in 2010, I started a project called torservers.net, which started as a non-profit in Germany, Zwiebelfreunde, Friends of the Onion. And there we focus on running anonymity infrastructure. So we provide a lot of bandwidth for the Tor network with infrastructure that we run and maintain. And this has grown into a network of now 24 organizations, all non-profits in 15 countries. So torservers.net is this network of organizations that all contribute independently to mostly the Tor network, but we also run other anonymity systems. In 2013, I joined a pretty new foundation called Renewable Freedom Foundation, funded independently by a newspaper publisher in Bavaria. And ever since then, I've been focusing on what we started with torservers.net, is this community growth and community building. And with the foundation, we're able to support early stage kind of conversations, groups that form, providing travel support. But also what I find myself in is a lot of mediation. It's a lot of conflicts moving around in different standardization conversations where people have very strong opinion on things, and we are able, thanks to our independence, since we are not actually involved in the projects that we travel in, to provide some kind of mediation or conflict resolution. And there, as Foundation, we work mostly with technology projects, but also with projects from the kind of legal sphere of privacy and advocacy side. We run a fund together with the ADRI network in Europe, supporting European digital rights. It's a small grants program, a participatory fund. We have a fund around digital whistleblowing technologies. And in 2016, we started the Center for the Cultivation of Technology. It's a subsidiary of that foundation that is also a charitable entity helping and developing open source technologies. We are working with projects like Tails, the RiseUp email provider, Schleuder, encrypted mailing lists. So a lot of projects in this space need advice on organizational management, on like how to get along together, but also a lot of the conversations we're having, since we are a funder, is we talk to a lot of other funding entities and we look for funding opportunities for open source projects that can be coming from the different areas. So that's the topic of this panel, is a lot of what I'm involved in, is conversations around the kind of funding that is out there, but also how does the project community of that particular project think about the boundaries of where do they accept US government funding or not? Do they accept private money from foundations or not? So that's a lot of interesting conversations to have, and I'm very happy to be on this panel. We're involved as Center for the Cultivation of Technology in a number of kind of research-focused projects within the Horizon 2020 framework program. And we work with foundations such as like Ford Foundation, Mozilla Foundation, the Open Technology Fund, to kind of develop strategies on how to best support open source development that is not necessarily only about funding, but also about providing security audits, providing user interface design advice, and there's a lot of interesting strategies on supporting open source projects from the privacy space. One thing that I want to mention that is very interesting is part of the Horizon 2020 and will be part of the next generation program afterwards by the European Commission, is the Next Generation Internet program. So we are participating in kind of intermediary structures to take money from the Commission, which at this point will be 10 million euros handled by us. There's another 10 million that will be cut up and split up to award to projects, because the Commission has realized that if you're awarding funding in the order of like 2 to 5 million, a lot of the projects and a lot of the communities we deal with aren't just able to provide enough kind of ideas to apply even for 5 million. So the Next Generation Internet program is something to really look out for. They want to scale this up. So it's 20 million euros now. There's another 20 million awarded this year, and then it will probably, if everything works out well, grow to at least 50 million that will be split up and given by intermediaries like us to open source projects from the field of like basic network technology, but also with a strong focus on privacy enhancing technologies.
Okay, thank you, Moritz. It's good news to know that it seems that the funding is finally coming to these technologies. So, Liz, maybe you can give us a perspective from the for-profit sector.
Yeah, so Least Authority is, as mentioned, a for-profit company. We believe that privacy is a right for people that people should have. So everything that we do with the technology that we work with, it all has a focus of privacy being a priority. We do a couple of different things within the community to work towards this mission that we have. One is that we build privacy-enhancing technologies that are also open source, but we contribute to open source projects and think more about how we can build privacy into tools that we are using or that should be used by people also. We also look at other people's tools that they're building, other people's code. We do reviews of it to see how that they're protecting privacy through things like security. So we do security audits and security consulting within the space. For those projects, it tends to be mostly open source projects, but we also do a lot within the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, where quite a few of those projects are open source too, but looking at are they helping to preserve privacy where they should. So what we do in terms of, so we do the consulting work, which helps. It's one potential business model, and that's a business model that works well for us. And then another thing that we have is that we do a hosted managed version of an open source project that facilitates secure storage. And so we believe that this gives people the ability to control their data, to make sure that their data stays private. They can store it in the cloud, and by doing the hosted managed version, we give them the convenience that we think some of the other commercial tools out there can offer, but with the privacy features that this open source project that we contribute to has also. The open source project that is called Tahoe LAFS, Tahoe Least Authority File Store, or Tahoe Laughs. And that is one of a few open source projects that we use in that hosted managed version of the secure cloud storage product that we run for people. And that's a subscription service that we offer. So that's another business model that we use to sustain ourselves. And in addition to all that work, we also just generally like to contribute to the open source and the privacy enhancing technologies communities. So for example, we recently did a project where we thought, this might not be super great for business, but wouldn't it be really cool if people could pay for our secure cloud storage with privacy, pay for it in a privacy enhancing way, in a privacy protecting way, I should say. So we said, we're gathering personal data about our customers in order for them to give us payments. That's not really in line with what our mission is, whereas we're not gathering any personal data about who they are when they're storing their data with us. So we thought, how can we fix this? And we spent some time on what was just a fun side project initially to look at how we could use things like Zcash shielded transactions. Zcash is a cryptocurrency that's privacy enhancing or privacy protecting. And then how could we combine that with using things like the Tor network to offer people an end-to-end private solution to pay for the storage service that we offered? So how little personal data, how could we build something that we could take no personal data from people? So basically, end-to-end privacy from payments to data storage with our service. And so as a business, this is again trying to fulfill our mission that we have to do privacy, to protect privacy for people, to do privacy enhancing technologies to contribute to the furtherance of, people having just generally more right to privacy. So that protocol that we spec'd out, we then we basically just wrote a specification and then just published it last week to the community in hopes that other people can just follow that as maybe a roadmap on how to accept subscription payments in a privacy-friendly way. So we just do a lot of different stuff towards that furtherance of goal of protecting our privacy rights with technology that's out there.
Thank you very much, Liz. And our last speaker is Harry, who I hope can give us also a good perspective on how to fund this anonymity technology.
Yeah, since everyone has carefully avoided the hard questions, I'm going to go straight for the hard questions. And I think the hard question historically that faces privacy-enhancing technologies is that, so surveillance capitalism clearly has a business model. And privacy-enhancing technologies actually do not have a business model. And historically, with the exception of Tor and the exception of Signal, they have failed to scale. They have failed to produce anything usable by ordinary people. I mean, we just have to admit the reality of this situation. And there's choices in terms of funding. And let's not mince words here, right? So essentially, there's either government funding from governments, or there's crowdsourcing funding from the general public, or there's private sector funding, venture capital, angel investment, and in the case of the work that, I historically do public funding. I work at Inria. I've worked with Francesca Bria in setting up the $30 million CAPS initiative, and we focused on European Commission funding. And we focused on European Commission funding in particular because, a lot of other government funding is very difficult for people to deal with. I would point the fact that, for example, it all sounds really nice, and I think Roger made the right decisions when booting up Tor, but let's face the facts. Public government money that booted up Tor was the Office of Naval Research. And I think they had perfectly good reasons, and it was the best funding you could take at the time, but is that the kind of funding we want current privacy technologies to take? Open Technology Fund is a US State Department front group. Let's not pretend it's not. Everyone knows that's the case. Henry Ford, he's not just some nice rich guy that happened to die. The leadership of the Ford Foundation are very great people, but historically, Ford got his money through politically dubious means, let's put it that way, or had politically dubious sympathies. And when you look at it that way, and you look at the fact that crowdsourcing funding historically does not, in a pure donation model, at least in my experience, tends to cap out at around 50K, it's probably time, particularly if there are regulations forcing the use of the technology like the GPDR, for people to take a serious look at the possibilities offered by private capital. And historically, if you go up to Silicon Valley venture capital or the very sparse venture capital space in Europe, and you said, hey, I want to fund privacy-enhancing technologies, they would say, you're crazy. Why don't you just build like a Google app? That would be great, and do surveillance capitalism. Maybe you can find a new market that Google's not properly surveilling, and eventually you'll sell it to them, or Facebook. And the great thing about the blockchain technologies, and I'm personally very skeptical of most of the relatively scammy work out there in the blockchain space, but let's be very honest. All of a sudden you have two things which have never happened before in venture capital history. You have young people, programmers who would otherwise, a micro generation ago, wanted to work at Facebook, Google, wanted to move to Silicon Valley. And what do they want to do now? They want to start a weird blockchain startup and base themselves out of Switzerland or Singapore or Malta or some of the European jurisdictions which are, unlike the United States, are friendly to blockchain-based ventures. And on the other hand, venture capital, which historically has ignored cryptography, has historically ignored distributed systems, believe that there's a new business model out there that I don't even know if they're right, but it's interesting that mainstream venture capital has come to the realization, they're saying, well, surveillance capitalism may not actually make us that much money, but tokens, some sort of weird tokenization model where people basically do micropayments for services, and that might actually be the new business model of the entire, future internet. And I think that's, they may or may not be right, but privacy-enhancing technologies should take advantage of this, I think. And if you look at it, there's a lot of skills that private venture capital has, which certain technologies, Signal comes to mind, followed, and they had tremendous scaling. And that's something that we haven't seen with any other privacy-enhancing technology except Tor. And I think that that's what we're doing in NIM Technologies. We're interested in commercializing anonymous authentication credentials, providing good anonymity for cryptocurrency transactions. And we personally think that now that there's been this historic shift in private venture capital mentality, which holds even during the middle of crypto winter, that this is like a once-in-a-generation moment to move the center of private funding, which really is the cause of the domination of the United States in terms of information technology, away from the United States to Europe, and to focus that funding on privacy, because privacy is the hardest of the problems that face distributed systems, economic incentives, and advanced cryptography.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Okay, so I want to ask our panelists if you, after hearing each other, you have any questions that you would like to ask each other, or otherwise we would go to the audience. So, any questions? No? Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience to start? Yeah, please use the microphone.
Yeah, I like the intervention from Harry actually, because I realized that all the European advocacy and also much of the technology space that is there depends on US money. Like rich kids from the US or like rich guys from the US donate some money to our projects here and to our idea of how policy should work. And I would like to see a little bit more of a discussion around how to change that in the mid and the long run, because it is the US is not what we thought it is, not as stable as we thought it is, and also this is just bad to be dependent from somewhere when we actually have like lots of resources here. So the question is, how can we change that in the short and the long run?
Yeah, if I may maybe make the question even broader. One of the things I was thinking when I was listening to our panelists is that, okay, we have Tor as one of the successful examples in this space, but to me the question is, should we try to replicate that success by using some of the same strategies, or was that a model that was successful at a time and in a certain context and in certain time? And these days, maybe we should be looking at alternatives that are not so much replicating, but maybe taking advantage of new things that are happening, such as, for example, interest from venture capitalists in the space. And I mean, that goes to the question of how do we, should we try to change our, diversify our funding, and how can we best do that? So I don't know if...
Yeah, I've got some answers. But
yeah.
Okay, so Tor started off, I was basically an academic research professor style person, so a lot of our funding originally was the professor model, including NSF grant, National Science Foundation grants, and science grants, but then it extended to DARPA grants, where it was still to do research and development, but then it was funding from the US military, and you're right that it gets ugly. I guess there are a bunch of different answers. One of them is we make sure to only do the things we want to do, but that makes it even more challenging to find the sort of funders who understand that that's how the balance works. We've actually worked hard for the past couple of years to try to get off of the US government money. There are several reasons why it's bad news to be so centralized in that way. One of them is who knows what Trump is going to do tomorrow. Another one is people wonder what the motivations are of the funders, and the reality for the funders is they're large organizations with individual humans who work there, and if you find some individual humans who want things like Tor to succeed, then they're the ones that you work with. But if you don't know how the funding proposal model works, it's easy to imagine that the NSA comes to us and says, I'll give you $1 million if you add this feature. It doesn't work that way at all. It's the opposite, where we think, okay, what are the things we want to have? How do we find some groups out there with funding who say they care about similar things? And then we try to phrase the stuff we want in a way that it looks recognizable to them as the sort of thing that they thought they want. And then you go back and forth until they finally say, yes, okay, here's a bit of money for that. So the 2017 budget, which is the last one we've crunched the numbers for, we were down to 51% US government funding. And part of that is because we had some Swedish government funding. And you could say to yourself, okay, well, Sweden is not so different. But another chunk of that, Harry mentioned 50K of donations was sort of his cap. We got something like 450K of donations in 2017, and Mozilla matched it. So that's a pretty cool direction that we need to push harder on. One of the other things that I find fascinating, back when we were taking mostly US government funding, there were people who were like, oh my God, the US government, oh my God. And now when Mozilla gives us 450K as a match, people are like, oh my God, Mozilla, oh my God. So, and for a while we had Google helping hire interns for us as part of the Google Summer of Code project to write free software. And then people are like, Google, oh my God. So whatever is giving you funding, as an organization, people are suspicious of it. And this goes back to what Harry was talking about, where whoever has aggregated lots of money has probably done it in a non-perfect way for society. So there are challenges all along the way.
I'll just say to that that I think that projects in the space, so there's a project kind of life cycle that has to happen, and a lot of things come out of research initially. But I think that the Tor model is a great model for some projects, but I think that some projects should also evaluate other models too, depending on what they're trying to build and what they want to incentivize and stuff. And so I think that they shouldn't shy away. Projects and privacy-enhancing technology projects shouldn't shy away from looking at doing for-profit businesses. They should just do so very carefully to look at the business model and what do they really want to incentivize, and how can they do that in ways that they don't, give up on their beliefs about privacy and stuff. And so I think that but it just takes more creativity, because a lot of the companies that we see that have gotten really popular don't do the whole privacy protecting thing. They collect our data. They have business models built off of personal data gathering and analysis. But so it just takes some creativity. But I think if we all work together as a community to try to, show new case studies of how that can be done, talk more about business models that aren't built on personal data, that those are other options to get away from the government funding also.
I think this kind of question about questionable funding is more relevant even in the kind of advocacy and policy space. And there it's really important to have these conversations. This is a technology panel, right? We're talking about technology, and technology we can always say, we're neutral, we want to provide anonymity that is not politically neutral, but it's at least in terms of like influences, it becomes, when you think about the technology and then you move into training for technology, there it quickly becomes murky, right? Who is funding whom to be trained to be able to use these technologies? But I think the panel participants here are more on the kind of research end and development end, where you could say that it's a bit less of an issue. It is something that we have to talk about, and that's why we're here, to find alternative and discuss alternative solutions. But I really encourage for this space to have that conversation about policy and advocacy, because there's only so much open society foundations and only so much of like US influences that not only provide funding, but actually drive the topics and the agenda, to be very clear about this. Going to kind of the technology in anonymity systems, that is kind of the primary focus of the panel here. You really want this diversity of actors, right? You want it to be available, and that's a difficult challenge, where you say a lot of the ideas of business models for storage, for example, and payments and things like that fundamentally are incompatible to a certain degree with the desire of an anonymity system to have a diverse set of users, but not only in terms of like anyone who could afford to participate. I think there's a strong component within the technology community that they don't want technology only to be available. You cannot provide a technology that only provides privacy to those who can afford it. And even just 1 cent to participate in an international payment system, a lot of the world is excluded of like not being able to participate, not being able to use cryptocurrencies or use credit card systems and things like that. And I think that looking at my conversations in the privacy enhancing technology community, there is just this level of kind of impossibility to still provide it as a free service for the global world to use. And that's a strong side of Tor, where there's a lot of proposals over time to financially incentivize operating the network infrastructure, to provide priority services for those who can pay. All these ideas are great, but they're fundamentally, for me at least, are at odds with the goal that you have as an anonymity system in society.
So this is interesting, because you're saying that because it's a social good, it should be available for everyone and not just for those who can afford it. But of course, then this, in terms of business model, introduces a gap.
It's public infrastructure, right?
Exactly.
We're talking about roads.
Yeah, yeah. You want to?
Let me jump in also. You also said the phrase neutral, technology is neutral. And that's exciting from my perspective because Tor is not neutral. We help people who have less power a lot more than we help people who already have lots of power. If you're the CIA, you're pretty good at controlling your own information and privacy and people and so on. You've got a budget for this, you've got people for this and so on. If you're an individual activist, you don't know how to blog safely, you don't have an infrastructure that you can make use of and so on. So Tor is much more useful for people who are currently on the wrong end of the power. And I think of it as, a lot of people look at this as it's a two-edged sword, you're helping these people and you're also helping these people. But the reality is that we help the people who are much more in need of help, much more.
Okay, do you?
And then Sasha.
You said that it is not such a big problem in the technology space and it is in advocacy, but you underestimate the dependency that, like when you, like in Europe, it's only like so privacy oriented because of advocacy, not because of technology. This is like the understanding that you need to have. So it means it is very, very strongly intertwined. And please don't underestimate that you have to look at the advocacy part as much as to the technology part. Yeah. Like you see UK where you go to jail for don't giving out a key or something like this. And if you have these hostile environments, technology doesn't help you at all. It's actually a threat to you.
Yeah. I think we had a question.
From Sasha?
Okay.
Oh, no?
Yeah, so one quick remark is that I believe every cultural artifact by default is always political, right? So technology is always political. And by default, if you don't think about it, your technical production will actually enforce the current structures. This is why Silicon Valley models and the kind of the way in which reaping data of people is taking into effect is actually providing more inequality, business models that are even more harvesting people than ever before. And if you don't believe it, just go watch the streets of San Francisco. So that's my personal view. But the actual question I would have to the panel is: so to me, government funding, private funds funding, like Ford or etc., or investors are in a way interchangeable. And the problem I have with all of them, and I think in that respect, Ford is only just the old investor, right? He's just as bad as the new one. So I don't really see a difference there. So I think like having different ways of getting money is fine, but one long-term problem I see with all of them is the very short horizon that comes with the funding, because also the angel investors want to cash in within a few years.
Please go to the
so
question.
what is your view on getting into more sustainable long-term business models that go beyond the kind of quick cash in or depleting your funds?
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to point out that just as you've said very correctly, Sasha, all technology is political, which I completely agree with. To some extent, or let's say it's completely analogous to the fact that all money is blood money. There is no pure or clean money. Money is produced by nation states or, God help you, solving hash puzzles. And that's just how it is. So the question with any funding source is what are the actual strings attached? Because every funding source does have strings attached. They just have different kinds of strings. If you take funding from a grassroots community effort, you have a bunch of people who believe that you owe them and they will follow you and make sure you fulfill your wish, and then they can't give that much money. If you take money from government, I think Roger's actually correct here on many levels. Often, I think there are less strings attached to government funding, a lot of slides and bureaucracy of European Commission funding, but than most ordinary people would assume. That being said, I would also say that a lot of private capital funding is interesting also, not because the strings attach, but because how they operate, because their goal is a little bit different than crowdsourcing government funding. So their goal is to have product which has adoption at scale. And in order to do that, they have a certain lack of tolerance for things that don't get users, that don't scale, that don't work. And they really want you to focus on the people who your product is serving. And so I'm just going to bring up, I think that's actually an advantage. I think companies and groups that kind of take approach which is very user-centric, and I put, to some extent Signal in this category, are groups that we can learn from. And so I was just, a few days ago, I was in Iraq. Turkey was drone striking northern Iraq, Dohuk to be precise. And they had kind of in cold blood killed an older man and a young child, which had led to a sort of civilian-led protest at a Turkish military base. And it was a big mess. And so people were very scared of what to do. And on this level, I think privacy-enhancing technologies to some extent fulfilled their goal. What you saw, interestingly enough, in Iraq, was that most people had a VPN. Some people using free VPNs. Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1 was used by some people. Most people had kind of dodgy for-pay VPNs. And when people were really scared, we would sit down with people, and they were very happy that they could use Tor and Tails, right? Particularly Tails, something which lets them boot up an environment where they can basically be assured that their computer is safe and they can do whatever web surfing to do without being fear of the local Iraqi or Turkish intelligence agency basically drone striking them. That's a real problem in certain parts of the world. And to this extent, I think it's a real success story for Tor. But then let's not look at what's going on the ground. Which is that the vast majority of people were using VPNs. If you look at the actual statistics with a lot of these privacy-enhancing technologies, like Tor, for example, is mostly American user traffic going to Europe and then being shipped back to America, right? That's actually, from what studies I've seen by Murdoch et al., Roger probably has more up-to-date data, but the question is, how can we make these privacy-enhancing technologies actually serve end users? And I think private capital is actually interesting because it introduces a set of accountability mechanisms that don't exist in traditional open source development. And the accountability mechanisms are, does it actually work for the user audience that you want, right? In Iraq, people are like, oh, should I use PGP? And they were using Signal, interestingly enough, and they were very concerned that Turkey was going to cut the internet and therefore cut their connection to Signal. And they wanted something that would work even when the internet was cut. And so, I suggested Briar. It's a bit flaky, but it would work in that mechanism. And what I would not suggest actually is projects that I've actually personally helped fund through EC projects like NextLeap. For example, Delta Chat. Delta Chat is an open source environment that does federated chat, but it forces people to use PGP. And what happens if you're using PGP and someone compromises your key, they can read all your previous messages and all your future messages, which is very easy to do on an Android phone, to compromise the Android phone and capture key material. Signal, WhatsApp, and other services do not actually have that feature. They have different security properties, and we can formally verify those properties. And I think what's happened in the open source community, which I think needs to be corrected, I actually think private capital is maybe a way to correct it, is that essentially we did a large scale largest scale study of this ever, looking at developers and high risk users. It's published in Security Standardization Research this year. Is that we actually found that developers are mostly not serving the end users they claim to serve. They're mostly serving themselves. They're mostly making stuff that they find cool, that they find useful, and they imagine that they are at lots of risk. Okay, but that may not actually be the product or the service with the actual privacy and security guarantees that are needed by people in Iraq or Europeans or whoever it is that's under whatever form of surveillance or threat. And what private capital forces people to do is they say, well, you need to take care of adoption measures. You need to show growth. You need to show that you're fulfilling these needs. And of course, there's all this dodgy marketing stuff that private capital wants you to do, which leads to all sorts of nonsense. But I do think that this user-centric focus on getting real feedback, looking at real feedback mechanisms, seeing if things can be sustainable, I don't think that's actually a bad move for privacy-enhancing technologies to take.
Okay, so I would like to, because we have been, we've talked quite a bit about funding now, I would like to go back to this community aspect in the sense that complex systems such as Tor, I mean, we've heard it has like several million users per day, several thousand operators, probably hundreds of developers contributing code. So how do you get, and the user base also has to be diverse, so it's not like you just need to tap into one community and you're done, because you want to have different communities. So how do you get all these different people to trust you, and or to trust each other in a way that the whole system can function? Like, how can you have transparency mechanisms that build this trust? And this is a question mainly for Roger and Moritz, because you're involved with projects that actually need to be very strong on this point in order to be successful. So if you could comment on that.
When I talk to kind of next generation anonymity systems developers, they really underestimate the amount of time just needed to build these community aspects into it, right? And we're looking at Tor project that is basically now 20 years almost of like making these connections, making this kind of connections between the different stakeholders, and slowly building it up. And in that sense, Tor is challenged often as being a blocker for any other system, because to reach that level of adoption and to even reach a similar level of anonymity guarantees, even if you have a system that might be stronger in certain aspects, if you don't have the user base, you cannot compete. And it's a question that we will struggle with, but I think in terms of Tor, I look at it as something that basically Roger incorporates this mechanism of being able to bridge different communities that would not even talk to each other. And I think it's if you ask me for advice or ideas or things that I've seen fail and things that I worked, I think it's really centered around individuals who get involved. And some individuals might be stronger to tap into certain communities than others, and to be able to like have a good core initial set of people involved in the project that kind of reflect this diversity and are able to translate between the different communities that they interact with, kind of is at the core. And this is not a technology problem, as you said at the beginning. So
having really good technical people is necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah, I think it really is about community building as a person-to-person thing. It's about going out and doing talks to a lot of different groups and figuring out what they care about and how to reach them. And it ranges from hackers to ordinary people to security professionals to law enforcement, and getting all those people to understand that the same privacy system is useful for them and they shouldn't be scared of it. It's about growing from one person to another. And I think Moritz is really right that getting people who are really well connected in a lot of different communities to spread from there, because I can't go to the Farsi speaking community and be one of them and understand what they're concerned about and so on. But I can build a tool that empowers them to change their world, and there are people in their community who understand that it's important, and they can pick up the flag and start leading from inside their community. So I think it's about empowering people to empower more people and so on. And you're right, that's not a technology thing. And this also answers Sasha's question a little bit. We're a $100 million organization with a $4 million budget. We do a lot more than our money can do. And that's because of the relay operators and the volunteers and the activists and the word of mouth and so on. And it's about sustainability, where you need the money in order to build the technology and so on, but that can't be, you can't be having to raise all the money to spend to do all the things. That'll never work.
Can I make a quick point? So I mean again, like, I think Tor is a huge success story. You know, Tor literally, was there, literally saved lives. Like last week in Iraq, people could use the Tor browser, boot up a Tails that probably prevented them from being drone striked. That's a big deal. But that being said, again, majority of people are using VPNs. How can we get to a point? Majority of people are worried that when the internet gets cut off, Signal and WhatsApp will stop working. Most people communicate over WhatsApp, actually. How is it that we can get to the point where we can actually build products that have privacy properties that serve the majority of the world. And Roger's completely right. It's $100 million problem. It's $1 billion problem. It's a huge amount of problem. And right now, you can't get those size of checks from nonprofits. You can get kind of decently sized $5 million checks from the European Commission. And you can get $5–10 million checks from private VC capital. And what I would argue is that maybe one solution is that we do build capacity outside of the United States, ideally capacity in countries which actually don't have capacity yet, outside of Europe, and that maybe the people who are privileged enough to be able to afford to use these technologies, particularly in, let's say, Europe, the United States, or other places, could, of course, via use of these technologies, subsidize lower cost or no cost versions of these technologies in places where people are more at risk. And I think that's a very powerful model that has not been explored, historically has not been capable really of being explored, maybe except with the disaster of Mojo Nation. And, but we should go and explore that. That's probably what we should be doing now, and that means that we should become less dependent on state funding, more in touch with the actual on-the-ground actors, and take some of the good stuff from Silicon Valley. Take product market fit, take user experience, take design knowledge. That could really be the killing edge that makes privacy-enhancing technologies actually usable for the next billion people. And that's what we should be having our eye on, not GDPR compliance.
Are there more questions from the audience? Yeah, please.
I have a question about the crowdfunding alternative. And completely intuitively speaking, in order for me to appear as essentially different, would be a case where the funding crowd is somehow balanced. In the case that it's not that a huge percentage of the actual funding comes from one or two sources. Because if it is like concentrated to a very limited number of entities, maybe it's not essentially different from the centralized alternatives that we get either in the private or public sector. So my question is actually, if you agree with this opinion, and in case you agree, if real world practice has shown that such a more balanced type of funding is something that we expect as a viable solution, or is an elusive goal?
EFF does it pretty well, but it took them 15 years to do it. So like everything else, it takes a long time to build up to it, but yes, it seems like a good alternative that's worth exploring.
Yeah.
I'd like to get back to the question about community. Is there missing scaffolding, whether social or technical, that could distribute the work of the community building? What would be needed?
I see a lot of the communities that come out of research or come out of a desire for technology around technologists, and we have all these diversity issues and things like that. And even at Tor, Tor is I would say even incapable of like dealing with the number of volunteer offers. Like there's a constant pattern of people coming up, and Tor is a good example there because it has the visibility and it has the brand, and anywhere any Tor people go, people come up and want to help, right? And we've been struggling with that in all of the projects and all of the communities. So I totally agree that there's a lack of mechanisms and established patterns, or as you say, scaffolding to incorporate and to grow this. And but this goes back to for me, community building is something that really it's not something that you can copy, because it's depending on who is involved in the project and who do they attract and who can they actually successfully and healthily integrate into their project community. Because if you give the wrong advice and people are struggling and are fighting and you're creating all these fights, that definitely is not community building, and it's not helping to But yes, it is a major problem that I see everywhere, is that on the one side you have a lot of volunteers and you have a lot of spare time that they are willing to put into something, and then you have the core people in the project that might also be all volunteers, but it's really difficult to transfer all the conversations you had in a small circle into something that you can just hand out to volunteers that come. So this will stay an ongoing challenge. And I think there is a good model to look at in the broader open source communities, like the Google Summer of Code model, where again it's Google. I mean, I don't have to say anything about that, but just in general, the approach of like having mentorship, having one-to-one relationships, making sure that the projects come up with a framing of a single idea that a volunteer can pick up. And in Google Summer of Code, it's not completely volunteer. They are getting some money paid, but I think there's a lot of good ideas there, and a lot of patterns are being developed in that space where there is some funding of like mentorship, internship programs, where we can try and look for ideas that can be translated into.
So if I understand, you're saying that it's difficult to replicate and it's difficult to make it scale, this community building, right? So it has to be very ad hoc and very tailored to the actual communities you're kind of integrating.
Yeah, one of the concrete challenges that we face right now, when I have some spare time, do I spend it mentoring people that we've already integrated and we're paying, or do I spend it on a nice volunteer who showed up and wants to help out? How do I balance that? And the answer is I have to do both, or the community will dissolve and it won't grow. And that's a scaling problem.
I think that this is something I would love to see people talking about more, just in general, like talking about looking at particular cases and doing more just in-depth analysis of, looking at maybe like Tor, what did you guys do over those 20 years to build that community? What were some like turning points through the history that really capitalized on that community, that engaged more people? And look at other open source projects that we all deem successful, and maybe not necessarily in terms of popularity, but maybe in terms of the community building, and saying, what did they do right? When did they do it? And who did it? And how do we make that assessment of, so that we can start to learn like there are patterns, and then we can analyze when these should be applied to new projects. So also figure out how to look at new projects and say, you know what, you're this type of project, you could really benefit from this type of action at this point in time, or this is how you get to that point in time because you need that. And I think that, so one thing that to mention, prior to doing what I do with Least Authority, I did work for the Open Technology Fund, and that was something that by working with all those projects that I greatly noticed was that it was just all of them needed that help with the community building, no matter how, and we work so hard on looking at technology, and we do all kinds of presentations about technology, and I don't think we do enough about how we are doing the people side of stuff, how we are doing the community, and that's also another interesting thing that's happening within the blockchain space, is this discussion of governance, of how are communities, how is the technology being governed, how are decisions made within those communities. And I think that just thinking more in terms of how are just the people working together, and how we can change that, and how we can use it as a powerful tool to also, or a powerful method of getting these projects to be more popular and scale.
Are there more questions from the audience? Okay.
Why isn't it possible that Tor, for example, is able to raise money like Wikimedia does? So when they does it, it's like, they put up a banner and it's like 60 million. This is, in my point of view, this is an example of how I would like to see funding in general, so that people actually pay for it, that understand how important it is for them. And with privacy, it obviously doesn't work that way, but we should get there.
We do have a banner every November and December in Tor browser, and that's what has caused us to get hundreds of thousands of dollars of donations each year. And it took Wikimedia decades to grow to what they're doing. A lot of the challenge here is that you have to figure out what you want, figure out how to get it, and then be persistent and stubborn and stick with it for many, many, many years as you grow the world that you want to be in. It's not like you just look around and say, oh, venture capital, I'll just take 50 million, okay, I'm done. There's a lot more to it.
Well, let's talk about, I mean, the enemy as well, the people who are out there to create surveillance capitalism. So, you know, Tor has a good group of programmers, I forget, you know, maybe up to 50 and 70 if you count the volunteers. Signal, I think, has never had more than 7. The dispersed open source community in, let's say, Europe's probably thousands, you know. It's hard to point to an exact project, but there's been lots of cool stuff over many years. That being said, if you go to like Facebook, or you go to Google, you actually go to Silicon Valley, or you go to their offices in Europe, what you have is you have hundreds of people programming, hundreds of people building the creme de la creme of surveillance technology. And the competition is small and it's heroic, but is it actually going to build a technology which can challenge Google and Facebook? I mean, realistically here, okay, I'm not gonna, you know, soften my punches here. And I think the answer is, it's hard to tell. I mean, you do have David and Goliath situations where David wins. I think Tor has been shown that it is indeed possible for that to happen. But it may not be the case for the infinite future. And if you look at the success stories, what you've seen is that huge groups of developers who feel, you know, who like each other, that helps. But you should never forget that technology does scale, and that you can look, for example, at the success of the Signal protocol, which Signal has 35 million users a day as an app, maybe 40. So it's larger than anything else in the space. And the protocol is used by WhatsApp and now Skype, so we're talking at least 1 billion people. And how did that happen? Well, it happened by basically having Silicon Valley adopt, more or less as a boutique feature, encrypted messaging. So we're making that something that consumers wanted, and they would choose differently. They would say, oh, I don't really trust Facebook Messenger, which no one should, so I'm going to switch to WhatsApp. Or I don't know, WhatsApp got bought by Facebook, and I'm going to switch to Telegram. Probably a bad move, but probably better than switching over to Delta Chat or whatever, some random open source project that maybe broke it. Although it would be better to go to OTR and Pigeon. Regardless, there's a lot of details. But what we've seen, and this is why I'm going to put the Inria hat on, is that we've also seen that open standards and working with large companies may actually lead to huge deployment. The reason why, likely, Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp are merging, which I know is a big antitrust issue, is because they're going to the same end-to-end encrypted backbone. And where does that end-to-end encrypted messaging backbone come from? It comes from research from Europe, University of Oxford and Inria, and how to build a protocol which has the exact same security guarantees as Signal, but which is an open standard and which scales to large groups, up to 50,000 people, something that Signal cannot currently do. And what we've seen is when you come to Silicon Valley and you say, or you come to anyone, also European companies such as Wire, and you say, we have this new protocol, it's got security proofs, it solves a problem that you don't have. It introduces more user privacy. And we think users would actually choose your product over someone else's product based on these constraints. What we've seen in the case of this protocol, message layer security, currently being standardized as the IETF, is that Facebook says it's great. Wire says it's great. The French government says it's great. Facebook says it's great. Google says it's great. And it will be in everyone's code, serving more people than even the Signal protocol serves today by probably the end of this year, if not early next year. So you can, there is the enemy, and they have lots of coding power, but there are places where you can actually get them to deploy large amounts of privacy-enhancing technologies. I mean, it depends how you feel about secure messaging. Maybe it's not exactly private. It's definitely not anonymous. Maybe Facebook just makes all the money off the metadata. But regardless, it's better than it was before. So I would also say that look at the scale of the enemy you're up against, but also look at how that maybe you can interface with them. And I think open source, open standards, and solid business models allow people to do that at scale. You can spend years working with hundreds of random developers, or you can get 7 people in a room, launch a protocol, get IETF standardization, and boom, you're serving 1 billion people in 2 years.
I wanted to ask Liz, it connects a little bit to what Harry was saying now. in the sense that it's taking us quite a long time to start seeing companies make money out of selling privacy products. And I'm very happy to hear that this authority has a sustainable and viable business model based on very aggressive data minimization practices of even trying to go the extra mile and remove payment information and so on. Do you think this would have been possible 10 years ago, or is this a product of the new environment of people being much more aware of privacy risks and that having changed effectively the demands of the public?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't working with Tahoe Laughs 10 years ago, but it did exist 10 years ago. So there weren't the same options back then? I can't speak specifically to that, but I do think in general from my experience around that that people are more interested in privacy now than they were just even 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I think that that's come around I think it's just a lot of things, just like community building isn't one answer. There's a lot of different things that have to occur over time at the right times to change that kind of wave or to scale something. And I think, with the privacy enhancing technologies, it's that the people creating them have learned a lot. It's different people. I think general public is more aware of the privacy issues that are out there. GDPR coming into play, I think, has an impact because, and then just you hear all these security breaches that are occurring in the companies that have huge honeypots of data that are getting hacked and stuff, and so you hear this and people care more. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a positive story that we have among all the privacy concerns that keep growing. At least it seems that funding is finally coming closer to.
I think we have a
long
way to go, though. I still think we have a huge way to go. So even though Least Authority is doing something in terms of a for-profit business on this stuff, we are not Facebook, but we're way, way far away from that type of company in terms of size or anything. So we have a long way to go, and but I think the only way to get there is to have more projects just experimenting in different ways, whether it's experimenting with private capital or fundraising, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, all these different things. We just have to do more stuff. And find the right people to build the communities and engage them in the right ways and just keep working at it, and we'll get further.
Yeah.
I have a question around the topic of mental health and activism.
It's the last question. We have 2 minutes to finish, so please be very brief.
I have a question around mental health and activism. I have a few friends who are working in this space, and I hear a lot of struggles around when do you feel that what you've done is enough to solve the problem that you're working towards, and how do you put personal boundaries around your own sense of well-being?
That's a big question. Any of you who manage people want to?
Do we have good answers?
I would be very happy to have that conversation offline after this, because that's at the core of basically what I'm doing in the last years. And it is a big issue. Mental health and activism has always been a big issue also in other communities. And it's definitely not something we can have a good answer for in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, well, in that case,
thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being at the panel and speaking at the panel, and for listening to the panel for your questions. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.